Hello again. Welcome back to the study of the book, The Wisdom of the Ancients, Mining the Riches of Genesis 1 through 11. My name is Steve Langford. I'm the author of the book, and I'm your guide on this study. In this video, we move to the third of the five ancient stories found in Genesis 1 through 11. We look at the story of Cain. Now, in the story of Cain, we see life after the garden, and we see how the consequences that took place in the garden experience ripple throughout the following generations. And we see how the decisions that were made in the garden are compounded and made worse as they go through the following generations. Now, in the story of the garden in Genesis 2 and 3, we deal with our relationship with God. In the story of Cain, we deal with the issue of our relationship with others. These two, the relationship with God, the relationship with others, is the essence of the spiritual life. Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and the second, to love your neighbor as thyself. Jesus said these two go together. And right here in the very beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures, we encounter those two great relationships and the challenges that they offer. Now, the story of Cain is known for Cain's murder of his brother, and then that famous question, am I my brother's keeper? The story of Cain raises three questions that are embodied in Cain's question. The first question is, how do we view and relate to the one who is different from us, the one who is other? The second question, or the second issue, is one that the Hebrew prophets was constantly confronting the Hebrew people with. What role, what responsibility do we have when we enjoy positions of power, privilege, affluence? What responsibility do we have when we enjoy those things to those who don't have those things? To those who are powerless, those like the widows and the orphans and the resident aliens, those who are easily exploited by the forces in society. The biblical language, the prophetic language for that issue is the issue of righteousness and justice. Justice is using power on behalf of the powerless, the widow, the orphan, the resident alien. And this story of Cain raises that question. What responsibility do people who enjoy positions of privilege, power, and affluence have to those who don't enjoy those positions? The third question that this story raises is, how do we use our power in all of its manifestations, all of its different kinds of power? How do we use our power on behalf of another, in relationship to others? The story begins by setting up a contrast between Cain and his brother Abel. That contrast is seen in three ways. The first way that it is seen is in how the birth is recorded. In Genesis 4:1, Cain's birth carries on extensively, beginning with how the man knew his wife, and she conceives, and she says of the birth of Cain, I produced a man with the help of the Lord. She attributed Cain's birth to the work of God in and through her. But in contrast to that elaborate description of Cain's birth, Abel simply gets this notice. Next, she bore his brother Abel. Notice that the way that Abel is described as is in relationship to his brother Cain. Cain is the primary focus of this story. The second contrast is in the names. The word Cain is associated with the word produced. It speaks of strength and power. Whereas the word Abel, the name Abel, is associated with breath, vanity, emptiness. And so in the two names you have the power and the powerful, and the weak and the powerless. The third contrast is in relation to their vocations. Abel was the keeper of flocks. Cain, like his father, was a farmer. Now, the issue, the trigger to the story takes place when the two brothers each bring their offerings to the Lord. And the scripture says that the Lord had regard for Abel's offering, that is, the fatlings from his flock, but he did not have regard for Cain's offering, that is, the first fruits of his harvest. Now, what I want you to notice is that the text does not tell us why the Lord had regard for one and not the other. We like to speculate. In fact, we want to figure it out. We want to be able to know what is pleasing to the Lord and what is not, so that what we do can be pleasing. But nowhere in the text are we given an explanation of why the Lord had regard for one but not for the other. It's not a matter of what they offered. It's not a matter of who they were or how they offered it. The question is left unanswered. And that's a reminder to us. It reminds us that God relates to us out of who God is, not out of who we are. God relates to us out of God's nature, God's character, not in reaction to what we do or we don't do. God relates to us out of who God is. Well, the story describes Cain's reaction to the Lord's disregard of his offering. It speaks of two ways that Cain reacted. The first was with anger. So Cain was very angry. He just wasn't angry. There was an intensity to his anger. And his countenance fell. That means his face fell. That means his eyes were cast to the ground. He couldn't look up. He couldn't see anything but himself and his own pain. He was totally absorbed with his pain. And the intensity of his reaction suggests that something deep inside of him was touched in this experience. Well, the Lord confronts Cain about his anger. Verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen?" The Lord's confrontation is an act of compassion. It is calling Cain to be aware of what he's feeling. It is calling Cain to be aware of his reaction and to learn from it. The Lord goes on to say, if you do well, will you not be accepted? Doing well speaks of how he deals with his anger, with his reaction, not a reference to his offering. The Lord is saying, Cain, be aware of what's going on. And if you handle it right, it's going to be okay. But the Lord gives him a warning. If you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. The first time the word sin is used in the scripture, and it's in the mouth of God. And it's not about breaking some kind of law or code the way we saw in the story of the garden. Here, sin is about how you live in relationship to another. Sin is essentially at its core a relational issue. And so the Lord is calling Cain to be self-aware so that he can learn from his reaction and thereby manage what he chooses to do. There's a spiritual truth there. The spiritual journey is rooted in self-awareness so that we can learn from our experiences and choose how we're going to respond rather than simply react out of our pain, out of our anger, out of our hurt. Well, Cain didn't have an answer for the Lord. But the text gives us hints as to why Cain was so angry and why his countenance was cast down. Do you remember the contrast between the names power and weakness? Do you remember the privilege that Cain enjoyed as the firstborn and Abel's identity was just tied to being his brother? You see, what happened when the Lord had regard for Abel's offering but not for Cain is that those roles were reversed. Cain got displaced as the privileged one, as the special one, as the one who was always loved and approved and applauded. Abel took his place. And in that experience of being displaced, Cain felt the pain of not being the privileged one. And so he began to see his brother as a competitor. His brother as one who would displace him. His brother as one who would take what was rightfully his. And so he was angry. But Cain didn't look at his anger or his downcast countenance. Cain didn't try to learn from his reaction. And so he couldn't get to that depth of understanding of what was going on so he could deal with it in a healthy way. Instead, what he did was to ignore what the Lord had to say. And in ignoring it, he began to plot. Viewing Abel as a competitor, one who took what was rightfully his, he began to plot. Cain's decision to kill Abel was one that was rooted in planning. It is what we call premeditated murder. The text tells us, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out into the field." Cain had a plan. When they were alone, the text says that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. The image is that of a wild animal rising up to attack another. And it calls to mind the Lord's warning. For when the Lord said, if you don't deal with your reaction and learn from it, sin is lurking at the door. And the imagery is that of a wild animal waiting to pounce. So that now Cain embodies the very thing that the Lord had said was going to happen. Well, the Lord was aware of what was going on. And so once again he confronts Cain. The Lord says, "So where is your brother?" And there's a spiritual truth in that confrontation. Resolution to any problem, to any wrongdoing, is only found when there is an honesty of facing it and dealing with it. Resolution comes by honest acknowledgement of what has been done. You see, we can't get away with sin. But Cain's response was to lie. He said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And in that response, there's another spiritual truth. You see, no sin, no individual sin ever stands alone. It always begets additional sins. One sin, murder, produced a second sin, lying and covering up. One leads to more. But the Lord did not allow Cain to get by with this kind of deflecting. You know, in the garden story, the couple deflected the Lord's questioning and their responsibility for the choices by blaming the other. Here, Cain outright lies. But the Lord doesn't allow him to get away with it. He says, even the ground is crying out. Can't you hear it? Listen to what the ground is saying. Somewhere there is a sacred covenant between the humans and the ground that has been violated. Adam was to till the ground. That's why he was created, and the garden was created for him. So there was a sacred bond between the man and the ground, and here Cain has violated that sacred covenant. And so just as in the garden, there were consequences for the couple's choices. So now Cain has to face the consequences of his choice of killing his brother. There are two different consequences. The first is, you are cursed from the ground. Now, in the garden, the ground was cursed, but not Adam. But here, Cain is cursed from the ground, so that with this violated covenant between Cain and the ground, now the ground would stand in opposition to Cain. That covenant has been broken, and it will no longer produce its strength for you. You are cursed from the ground. Cain lost his livelihood. Cain lost his vocation. Cain lost his connection with his dad. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield you its strength. The second consequence is that you will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. You'll have no place where you are at home. Cain viewed his brother Abel as a competitor, and one who would displace him, who would take what was rightfully his place and his privilege in the family. And as a result of it, he lost the family, the place and the privilege he had in the family, but his place and his privilege in the larger human family. There would be no place where he would be at home. And of course, with these consequences, Cain begins to lament and begins to complain. When you're accustomed to power and privilege and you have to start dealing with being powerless, there is a great reaction, and that's what's going on in Cain's heart. As he laments, as he complains, it's as though he's crying out, "That's not fair. You can't do that. That's too much." And notice what the complaints that he makes. "My punishment is greater than I can bear." That's too much. That's not fair. Number one, you've driven me away from the soil. And that's what the Lord had said. The soil had lost its connection to Cain, and so he had lost his livelihood. "I shall be hidden from your face." The Lord didn't say anything about the Lord's relationship with Cain. Cain is the one who says, now that relationship is broken. Cain put that on himself. "I will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Yes, that's what the Lord said. There would be no place where he would be at home, no place where he could feel safe, no place where he would feel valued, no place where he could have standing among human beings. And then he says, "And anyone who meets me will kill me." Now he's feeling the vulnerability of being powerless. He is feeling what Abel lived with, that sense of being powerless, of being one below those who enjoyed the positions of power and privilege. The Lord's response is the same kind of response the Lord had to the couple. As they began to deal with the consequences, the Lord did not abandon the couple, and now the Lord does not abandon Cain. The Lord puts a mark on him to protect him, promising a sevenfold vengeance. That is a divine, the number 7 is a divine number, and so the Lord is going to take divine vengeance on anyone who tries to kill Cain. The story ends with 2 notes. The first is that Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. Cain turned his back upon the Lord. It wasn't that the Lord turned God's back upon Cain. It wasn't that he was driven from the Lord's presence. Cain intentionally turned away from and walked away from. And we'll see the consequence of that decision rippling throughout the generations that come in the genealogy that follows. But not only did Cain turn away from the Lord, Cain settled in the land of Nod, and the word Nod is the word meaning restless. So there's a play on words there. He settled in restlessness. Cain never knew peace. There was an internal restlessness in his heart and in his mind and the interior realm of his life, and he could never live at peace. Finding peace, a place to belong, value, and safeness. Cain's story moves naturally then into Cain's genealogy, and 5 levels of descendants are listed. And the last of those, the 5th generation from Cain, is a man by the name of Lamech. And Lamech is known for several things. That's where the genealogy was going, was to Lamech. Lamech was the first who was a polygamist. He had 2 wives. And while his children were successful in their fields, Lamech brags to his wives, saying, "Anyone who hurts me, I'll kill them." Lamech lived by a spirit of unlimited, disproportionate retaliation. Lamech said, I don't need the Lord to protect me. I'll protect myself. And anyone who hurts me will live to regret it because I'll kill them. Well, the spirit of unlimited retaliation, of disproportionate retaliation, creates a world full of violence. And the very next story, the fourth story that we'll look at in the next video, is the story of a world filled with violence. A world living out of the spirit that Cain's descendant boasted about having. A spirit of unlimited, disproportionate retaliation. Lamech said, I don't get even. I get revenge. This story of Cain raises the issue for us of how we live in relationship with others. It raises three fundamental questions. How do we view and how do we relate to the one that we see as different from us, who is other than us, who is not like us? Do we see them as a threat to be eliminated? It raises the issue the Hebrew prophets raised. There are those of us who enjoy positions of power, affluence, privilege. What responsibility do we have to those who don't enjoy those privileges in our society? And it raises the issue of power. How do we use the power that is ours because we were created in the likeness of God? Created to use power the way God uses power. To bring life into being and to nurture it into maturity. God has entrusted us with that power. The question is, how do we use that power in relationship to others? I suggest to you, the way we use our power depends upon how we view the other. Well, there's a lot to digest in this great story. There's a lot to reflect upon, and I assume there's a lot for you to discuss as you reflect together, as you probe the thoughts that the Spirit has stirred inside of you, as you share with one another, and then as you pray with one another and for one another about how to live out the great truths that are reflected in this historic narrative. Then we'll gather again for the fourth story, the story of the flood. And I trust that as you explore this story, you'll find that the story of the flood also brings deep theological truths to bear upon your spiritual life. I would enjoy hearing from you at Pastor Steve Langford, DMIN@gmail.com. Feel free to reach out to me. Until then, I pray that the Spirit will guide you as you mine the depths of the riches of this ancient story. It's more than just a story. It is full of theological truth. Until then, the peace of Christ be with you.